pointer. But the education levels are extremely low. So only about 25% of people even have a high school degree or better. And even 7% haven't even been to high school at all. So this is an extremely disadvantaged group in terms of education. And of course, that's going to have impact on employment and so on. The other thing to look at here is the substance abuse risk. That's a scale that MDOC uses to assess people's substance abuse risk. And there's only a very small, you can see there that about 41% have a high likelihood of dependence. Another 15% are for sure dependent on drugs and alcohol. And so that presents a huge risk coming out of prison and potentially getting back into to substance use. The other things to note is that there's, as Jeff said, this is mostly a male population. You can see, Jeff also referred to the importance of race. It's very hard to talk about the criminal justice system without talking about race. Blacks are very much overrepresented compared to the Michigan population, about 15% of the population, but 54% of our parolees. And the other thing to notice is that there's relatively, compared to the general population, relatively low levels of social support. For example, only 12% of people when they come out of prison are married. And so that, if you're married, you have a place to come back to, a home, but most people don't have that. So the first thing we did was, and this took us many months, was to figure out where people are actually living when they come out of prison. And so each dot represents a person. Of course, there's 11,000 dots on here. This is the whole population. And so one thing to take away from this is that this is an issue that faces the entire state. This is not just about Detroit or Wayne County, but almost every community in the state has people returning from prison. And the other thing you can kind of see is that if you were where people are going back to, of course, maps onto where the population centers are in the state. So there's quite a degree of concentration, but there's also a lot of variability in the types of places that people are going. So this is just to sort of set up the next analysis. One thing we've done recently is just to sort of divide the state into regions. Where we've borrowed a MDOC regional divisions here, just as a sort of first cut. So as I go through, I'm going to divide the state into southeastern Michigan, sort of to the right of the black line there, southwestern Michigan, and then we've combined the north and the UP just because we don't have that much data in the UP. Or I guess what I'm calling in the slides I'll call central and UP. So as I said before, parolees are returning pretty much to where the population centers are. So if the left graph here is what region parolees are returning to, and then the one on the right and the bottom is just where's the Michigan population according to the 2000 census, and you can see they're pretty closely aligned. You can't read the numbers from here, but about 58% of Michigan's population is in the southeast of Michigan, and about 60% of the parolees are going back to the southeast. Where we see differences is if we look at urbanicity. So this is, are you in a rural area, a suburb, or a central city? And so if we look first at just where the Michigan population is, we can see that about 62% of the Michigan population lives in suburbs, 20% in central cities, and about 18% in rural areas. If we look at where parolees are going to, they're highly concentrated, or much more disproportionately going to central cities. So 53% of parolees are going back to central cities. And sort of we've found the same thing as that Pew report that Jeff referred to. About almost 30% of people are going back to the city of Detroit. And if we just look at Wayne County, about 35% are going back to Wayne County. So this is just to give you a sense of where people are going to. And there's quite a, even within that, there's quite a degree of spatial concentration. So the way researchers think about neighborhoods is we use what are called census tracts. This is what the Census Bureau uses to measure, to sort of define neighborhoods. Usually a population of about 4,000 to 8,000 people in a census tract. And we see that a lot of the parolees return to a small number of neighborhoods in the state. So just 12% of the state's census tracts receive half of all parolees. And 2% of the census tracts receive a quarter of all the parolees. So there are some communities that are being particularly impacted by the return of people from prison. But on the other hand, parolees are spread throughout the state, as we can see from the map. There's about 2,700 census tracts in Michigan. 78% of them receive at least one parolee. And this is just in 2003. And there's also quite a bit of variation in how many parolees are going to what tracts. Their range in our data is 1 to 509. That 509 is somewhat an artifact of a policy. There's actually a center that in 2003 people were going back to in that neighborhood, so there was a lot of folks going to that one census tract. So what are these neighborhoods like that parolees are going to? What we've done here is the left column here shows the characteristics of the average Michigan resident's census tract. So if the average Michigan resident, what is your neighborhood like? And so the average Michigan resident lives in a census tract that's the poverty rate is 10%. The unemployment rate is 6%. Remember, this is from the 2000 census data. The 8% of households are on public assistance, and so on. The median income is $55,000 in the typical census tract in Michigan. If we do the same calculation for our parolees, we see that they are going back to much more disadvantaged neighborhoods. So the average parolee goes back to a neighborhood that's 20% poor rather than 10% poor. The unemployment rate is almost twice as much at 10%. There's a huge difference in median income, $40,000 median income versus $55,000. There are some things on which there aren't any differences. If we look at concentration of immigrants or the age structure of the neighborhood, there's not a lot of differences, but I've sort of highlighted the main things that are different. What I'm going to do from now on, since a lot of these characteristics are, of course, highly related to one another, so a high poverty neighborhood is going to be a high unemployment neighborhood as well, I'm just going to focus on the percent poor as sort of a metric that we can understand as I sort of go forward and break some of this down. So this graph shows the same kind of comparison separately by region and by urbanicity. So what we can see is that the disparities between the typical Michigan resident and the typical parolee exist in all three of the regions as we've defined them. The disparity seems to be largest in the southeast, so these differences aren't that big. What's more interesting is the central city suburb rural breakdown. We can see that actually in rural areas, parolees are going back to neighborhoods that are typical of rural areas, so they're not any more disadvantaged than the typical rural resident in Michigan. And central cities as well, the disparity is less, though that's largely because central cities themselves have such high poverty rates. So we cut the disparity, but that's in part because our central cities are doing so poorly. And we see the biggest gap still in the suburbs, and that's in part because, again, remember, suburbs were 62% of the state. That's a very sort of diverse set of neighborhoods. So another question we might ask is which parolees are going back to poorer neighborhoods? And so what we've done here is, for those sort of who want to know the details of the statistics, we've run what's called a regression model where we're predicting the poverty rate of the neighborhood, and then we're putting our variables in those individual characteristics that I showed you at the beginning to see which ones predict going to a higher poverty neighborhood, net of the others, so holding the others constant. And the things that come out as being important are race, so African American parolees are going to much more disadvantaged neighborhoods. Older parolees are going to more disadvantaged neighborhoods. Less educated parolees are going to more disadvantaged neighborhoods. Unmarried parolees, and then parolees who have been in prison 5 times or more. So the sort of most hardcore offenders are going to the most disadvantaged places. We didn't find any differences by gender, by the type of offense, including sex offenses, by whether there's a mental illness, at least known to the Michigan Department of Corrections about this person, or the number of children that somebody has. So in a sense, the most disadvantaged, one thing to take away from this is the most disadvantaged parolees are going back to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. So we're sort of doubling up on on the disadvantages